So, Dr. Friston, thank you so much for being here. It's an absolute pleasure to have you.
That's great to be here.
So, you are obviously incredibly famous for a variety of things, one of the main ones being the free energy principle. But before we turn to that, I do want to ask a bit of a different kind of question. So, in the space of ideas, they obviously come and go, some of them working out, some of them not. Were there any ideas that you were fond of that didn't make the headlines but led you to an interesting conclusion?
That's a very interesting question. Um, Not so much an idea, but certainly an approach to um, characterizing the way our brains work using brain imaging. You know, myself and a number of colleagues, spent a long time in the 1990s trying to develop ways of looking at distributed patterns of activity in the brain and trying to infer the structure of or the patterns that or the structure that underwrote the patterns of brain activity. Um, and that approach, possibly because it was before its time, never really got any purchase in the users of brain mapping software, at that time. But it certainly yielded an insight which was very useful, which reflects one of the two principles of how our brains are organized, namely functional segregation, the notion that different parts of our brain are specialized for certain functions, and that those or that specialization is segregated. So for example, there's a little area about the size of my thumbnail specialized for visual motion processing. The other principle is integration, the coordination of activity in our brain as it does its information processing. Um, and that second theme became more and more important as the science of brain imaging neuroscience, became more mature. So certainly it was a failed endeavor in terms of getting people to adopt and to use multivariate analyses, looking at sort of, I repeat, systematic patterns that were a reflection of how one brain area influenced the activity or the processing in another brain area. But over the subsequent decades, that um, agenda of understanding functional integration in the brain became more and more important, and today is now talked about in terms of functional connectomics and functional connectivity and effective connectivity. So, the insights accrued at that time were very useful as setting the scene and a backdrop to what subsequently became an important endeavor in understanding functional brain architectures.
What is the value of going forward with an idea that may not be making the headlines, but still is interesting to you? It feels like a lot of people, maybe I can speak not as an academic, but just of academia in general, want to pursue ideas that will, leave a legacy, that will make the headlines, that will make them a pile of money, instead of going for the interesting things, the more philosophical. What's the value of the latter?
Again, that's a very interesting question. I I have probably naively assumed that sticking to what is quintessentially interesting is the way to leave a legacy and to make money in the long term if everything eventually becomes monetized in the way that we sort of apply our science. So, uh, the certainly in my academic life and then those of my colleagues, we always pursue the most interesting avenues. And those avenues are usually at the frontier. They're usually sort of at the envelope of development. So you're very much like an explorer. You are going to places that no one has previously gone before. Um, and as such, there are no landmarks or points of reference to tell you whether you're heading in the right direction. All you know is that you are pushing the boundaries, um, in the fond hope that you're heading in the right direction, and that if you are going to discover something or invent something of use, then it will be useful to everybody. And I have to say that one, one caveat here is that you're really trying to answer questions that enable other people to answer their questions, just conditioned upon the almost common sense notion that to be a good scientist is to ask the right questions that have not previously been answered. I'm just mindful of the second little message left on Richard Feynman's blackboard, purportedly at the point of his death. One of which, of course, underwrites sort of our work, which is, that which I cannot create, I do not understand. So you have to have a generative model. But underneath that, know how to solve every problem that has been solved. So know what is behind you
Mm.
in term, and that does provide a sense of direction if you know what has been solved and how to solve it, and then you can ask the right questions that have not been answered or not been solved. So the mark of a good scientist is the ability not to provide answers and solutions, but to address and commit to the right questions, and that basically defines it for certainly for me what is interesting, what is unknown. And of course, I could witter on about that being a fundament of just existing as curious entities or curious creatures. We're always trying to resolve our uncertainty about either our scientific world or our financial world, our social world, or just me.
I'm going to ask a meta question now, but it is going to dig a little deeper into what you just brought up. How do you deal with the anxiety of the uncertainty when you're digging deeper, when you're dealing with that uncertainty? It does feel like as a scientist or as an individual, there's a certain kind of social anxiety is the wrong word, and cosmic anxiety is a little meta to use, but anxiety does feel like a nice umbrella term. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, well, I think those terms are perfectly apt, to be quite honest. You could actually frame it as a kind of existential angst when it's not going very well as a scientist. How do you deal with that? Um, Dealing with it, I think, is just a question, anecdotally, of experience. That if you focus and drill away on a particular problem, then it will dissolve ultimately. But you have to be very committed, and sometimes it can take many years. Um, just to give you a sense of the time frame, usually um, software technology that I've been involved with of an enabling sort um, and the attendant ideas usually takes about 5 to 10 years before it becomes sort of mainstream or people don't even bother referring to the primary sources for it. I have a colleague, Anna, who is an expert in the way in which ideas and memes disseminate and propagate and get uptake in the history of science. She tells me it takes about 40 years for a good idea to
Hmm.
actually make a difference. So you have to be very patient. You really have to commit your life to it. It's not the kind of thing you can solve in a sprint cycle or next month or in a PhD. You've really got to focus in the long term with that long term trajectory in mind. I noticed when you started, you were asking about leaving a legacy. I mean, in a sense, leaving a legacy is just really participating in an intellectual, scientific, and or possibly cultural ecosystem um, that is adds to its self-sustainability. So if ideas persist over time, then by definition they have a legacy. And of course, it's only those ideas that make a difference that are going to persist over time. But that time frame can be very long. So the game then is just to position yourself either academically or in industry where you've got that long runway, not in weeks or months, but in years and decades.
I mean, that's beautifully put, and it does kind of put a bow on everything that we've talked about in the sense of there is this kind of, as we were saying, strive to leave a legacy, and now we have this strange, unhealthy relationship with time, and we want these things that will happen in years and decades to happen in weeks and months. And if you're not focused on making that pile of money and just leaving the legacy, but you're focused on what can I do to improve humanity day to day? What can I do to improve and move the needle in this year, in this decade? Then you are more likely to leave that legacy, which is kind of ironic in that way. Those that pursue something end up having a more of an absence, where those with the absence end up being in the pursuit of it. So let's actually turn to the brain now. This kind of sets up the free energy principle, but for someone that has never studied the brain, just knows of it, they probably have one. What would you say and how would you describe the human brain to someone? And then further, what are some maybe facts about the brain that people might not know and be surprised by?
So the brain is literally a fantastic organ. And I use the word fantastic in both a vernacular but also technical sense, in the sense that it can generate fantasies. It is a creative, constructive organ. Um, Unlike the heart or the liver, um, it is in a position of making sense of the world via our sensory organs. They come in many, many different flavors. And crucially, um, is responsible for all our behaviors. And our behaviors, the way that we sort of, by which I mean the way that we act back upon the world. So we have the world out there, if grant me that metaphysically, that is impinging upon our sensory epithelia, our sensory organs. Epithelia is sheets of cells, so like the retina or the skin. Um, and we couple back to the world, we navigate, we exist in that world by acting. And I'm always amused by the fact that the modalities with which we act in the world are actually very limited. We can either sort of move our muscles, specifically striated muscles, or we can secrete something, and that's it. But by skillfully and carefully moving our muscles and secreting in the right kind of way, we can persist. We can leave a legacy in the sense that we're still here 10 years later, and we have a kind of sustainability and self-maintenance. All that rests upon the brain. So the brain is in charge of assimilating all the sensory evidence at hand that the world impresses upon its sensory organs, and then reciprocating with effectively predictions of what I'm going to do next, and then what are called reflexes. Your listeners may be familiar with the knee reflex, for example. Those are beautifully architectured peripheral mechanisms that we are endowed with at birth by evolution that allow the brain to prescribe certain movements, either physical movements with the body or autonomic reflexes within the body in terms of your heart, the function of our heart and our guts and all other of these sort of autonomic systems that are essential for our physiology. So, how does the brain do that? Well, it can't see the world directly. It is skull-bound. It lives as a lump, which is probably, if you actually saw it, it would look a little bit like a smooth, pinky, fleshy cabbage. And it sits inside our skull. It is skull-bound. And that's interesting because although you may think you see the world, the actual brain itself is locked in this completely black cavity, and only has access to the world through these very limited and sparse ways of sampling with our eyes and our ears and our taste and our other sensory modalities. So you've got this organ, this fantastic organ that sits inside your skull. Anatomically, you can think of this basically as, I repeat, a cabbage-like shape that comprises what's called grey matter. So people talk about grey matter. What they mean by that is that if you were to do a dissection, you would find that the surface of this very folded cabbage, so the surface invades into the brain in things called sulci. This cabbage is covered with grey matter, a few millimeters thick, and the rest of the brain are wires, effectively communicating between the sheet the sheet, which would be the size of a large tablecloth, for example, wrapped up, that contains all the processing elements known as nerve cells or neurons, and they all talk to each other through what are called axons, or effectively long wires that are all insulated, very much like the wiring in your house, with fatty myelin sheaths, cables, which endow this part of the brain, the interior connectivity, the connectome that we're talking about, earlier, with a white appearance on dissection. Um, so you've effectively got this organ, this fantastic organ, that is essentially a computer. Um, and although a soft and wet computer, it works simply by responding to inputs, assimilating those inputs in a particular kind of way, and ultimately generating predictions of how I'm going to move or how my autonomic reflexes should reset themselves to maintain our homeostasis, both in a physiological sense, but also in a more general sense, and a social sense, and intellectual sense, and everything else that makes you the kind of thing that you are. Uh, I could go into more detail. Much of when I talk about functional anatomy, what I basically meant was the anatomy of this fantastic organ, understood in terms of the neuronal processes that afford it this remarkable capacity for sense making, for sentient behavior, for active inference, for active sensing. And that has been largely the hallmark of my career, understanding both from the point of view of the physiology of the brain, the way that the brain activates and responds to various controlled inputs, and also prosecutes its predictions about movement, using brain imaging on the one hand, and then of course the things like the free energy principle and active inference on a more functionalist, well, computational level, and trying to find the right calculus that can describe the workings of this fantastic organ.
I have two questions lined up. I'm just trying to choose which one I want to ask first. But just as a kind of challenging question, interesting question, those axons and dendrites and synapses in your head, you have 100 billion neurons, and that amounts to 100 trillion synapses around there. That's you up there, in theory. And the question I have for you is, do you think that identity extends outside of the brain or is just held in here?
Identity in the sense of selfhood. I think I think you could. I think most people would argue it's all in there,
Mhm.
and some people would argue there isn't anywhere else. There's nothing out there other than the sense and the way that you understand and perceive the world as part of your brain. And you do that incredibly efficiently. You asked for one fun fact. I suspect that many of your viewers will know this, but the the capacity of the brain to do computations which surpass state of the art machine learning, artificial intelligence, in the sense of being agentic, in the sense of actually prescribing the right way forward in terms of data mining, or in terms of moving, or um, driving your car, for example. They do that with less electricity than it would take to run a light bulb, about 20 watts. Fantastically efficient, absolutely remarkable. What you would require a complete supercomputer and possibly a nuclear power station to power, um, in order to reproduce the same functionality, um, in silico on a sort of von Neumann architecture, the brain can do with 20 watts. Having said that, it it's a hungry organ. It consumes, even though it's a small percentage of the meat that comprises me. It still takes about 20% of the energy that I generate through my metabolism and through eating and breathing and the like.
You've used the word twice now, so I do want to double click on it. Efficient. What is like, can we talk more about the efficiency of the brain?
Yes, we certainly can. And I'm glad you picked that up. So I'm sorry, I'm just trying to remember your previous question in case as as I said, I tend to go off on tangents, so you have to stop
No,
me.
no, you're all
Um,
good. No, we were talking about how your selfhood is extended.
Oh yes, yes. So yeah, I mean that's a really yeah. Right. Okay. So let's not forget the efficiency, but let's just talk about extension. Um, so I was reading your question really as where where does selfhood come from, and where does the awareness of selfhood come from? And that's a really deep question, in the sense that lots of things may have brains, but they don't necessarily have even a minimal selfhood. You could argue that um, uh, in a general sense, in the sense of basal cognition, even single-celled organisms have a kind of fantastic functional architecture in their intracellular dynamics, which is a little bit brain-like. Um, and that they survive and they behave like viruses, for example, in a way that leaves a legacy because they propagate and they divide, and they make a difference. Um, but I don't think many people would argue that single cells or even simple multicellular uh, organizations um, have a notion of selfhood or even have the agency or the autonomy that would qualify as me as agent. Um, and even if they did, if we move through to higher animals or larger insects and sort of, say lower mammals, um, where you could impute that there is true agency and autonomy and an ability to plan, that doesn't necessarily mean to say that the sense making of their brains would know that. They wouldn't know that it was them that was the agent causing their sensorium. So what you're talking about is something which I think is probably quite privileged to very sophisticated, very complicated creatures like you and me, that not only are we true agents, we actually know we are true agents and we can contextualize that. So when you say, where is the self? I was reading that as the self that I am aware of as a particular hypothesis that explains all the sensory information available to me. It's only hypothesis. There are psychiatric conditions, depersonalization, derealization, um, various disorders of self, perceiving self and other, um, where that sense of self can go away, and it can be absolutely terrifying. So we take for granted that you are you and I am myself, but that's just a hypothesis. It can be replaced with an altered hypothesis that I am not me or you are not you. And Sometimes that's not terrifying, say, sort of non-dual states, oceanic states, where you are at one with the universe. That kind of selfhood can be either skillfully dissolved if you're a meditator, but also if you have a particular psychopathology, you can lose that. So that kind of selfhood, I think, is very private, and it's just something that you are experiencing in a qualitative sense. I can infer that you're probably experiencing it because you're so similar to me, and I know that I have selfhood, or I'm aware of my selfhood, and I indeed have a narrative self and an embodied self and all sorts of different kinds of self, and I can infer, given your behavior, namely your conversation in this instance, that you possibly have that as well. But I will never know.
The
I really
philosophical zombie problem comes into
Exactly.
effect.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Absolutely. Um, However, having said that, I'm wondering whether you use the the word extended out of courtesy to the notion of extended cognition and some of the four E's. And I think that's an important sort of caveat to, or an important perspective just to sort of nuance the answer to your question. And certainly in the notion of the designer environment or situated cognition that is quintessentially inactive because I have a body that acts, and also in the sense of extended cognition, I think that is a very interesting perspective, and what that basically means from my perspective is a lot of my sense making and the equipment that I use to make sense can actually be extended into the environment. So I imagine that you were referring to sort of iPhones or computers, for example.
Exactly.
Yeah, so the, my mnemonic capacities, remembering all the phone numbers of all my loved ones, for example, are very much well, the pressure is taken off them simply because I can store them in an iPhone and I now know where to find that information. So I think that kind of extension into the environment is absolutely is very important, and it's certainly a feature of our lived world. Certainly over the past few decades. So I think that that kind of extension is really um, a particular expression of the way that we exchange with the world and can offload a lot of cognitive competences understood as a sort of in the context of cognitive neuroscience um, into the artifacts around us. And you can even argue that, to a certain extent, we can do that in a federated way through cooperation with other people. We can get into arguments about sort of cultural niche construction as one aspect of this sort of decentralizing or federating our our cognition. So I think that
Dr.
that's an
Friston, sorry, just to interrupt you just for 1 second, just to talk about extending into an iPhone or into a computer. Um, would that also abstract and apply to the internet in general, like to Google, for example? Because I can offload, my phone numbers into a phone, but I know where to find it.
yes.
Would that also be the same kind of concept or notion towards Google, where I don't need to actually offload anything, but I still know where to find information. So in a sense, there is a link in selfhood. Would that make sense or no?
Um, I haven't been asked that question before. It certainly makes sense the way that you pose it. Um, the Yes, I think that is a perfectly reasonable perspective, and I'm mindful of similar arguments that you probably get from people like my friend Mike Levin about basal cognition, not in people, but usually he tries to tell a story that would open the eyes of cell biologists to the potential of thinking about the way that things self-organize from a cognitive perspective. And certainly, one of the arguments here is that multicellular organisms can have this distributed cognition, which doesn't deny the fact that any single cell or any single person is a cognitive entity, but there are sort of cognitive architectures, processes, sometimes framed in terms of inference and Bayesian mechanics. I notice my friend Chris Fields is using the word Bayesian satisficing as a description of self-organization that can transcend a single cell or a single person. And then I think you're looking at sort of joint inference that where the selfhood now has a different kind of boundary, or the self has a different kind of boundary. So I think that's a very reasonable thing. And certainly, when talking about the iPhone, I actually had in mind sources of information that I could go and forage for epistemically on Wikipedia, on Google, from a large language model. All of these, I think, are nice examples of extended cognition. And perhaps it's interesting to reflect upon the attention that large language models have attracted over the past few years. The very fact that they use language means that they're speaking the same language as me, which means that they are now an extension, certainly, of me as a representative of the cultural niche that I have inherited from my forefathers, and now the large language models have inherited. So they are, if you like, conspecifics in that space of language, which means that I can now regard them in exactly the same way as tools that extend my competency. Um, uh, yeah, I would certainly include any electronic device that aids in our epistemic foraging, in our again coming back to where we started in terms of how do we scaffold our lives? We do that to resolve uncertainty. We are curious creatures, and what that simply means is we're always seeking information. We're always behaving in a way that maximizes um, the information gain, that resolves our uncertainty, and then to answer your previous question, that's how you deal with existential angst.
Mm.
You act in a way to resolve that angst by simply resolving uncertainty, by asking questions of the world in the right kind of way, performing the right experiments, or making the right queries, or soliciting answers from the right large language model or the correct Wikipedia page. This is all, I think, part of the same process.
It's a nice way to look at life where we're just spending our entire lives trying to resolve uncertainty. That does give you a fuzzy feeling at the end of the day. So when we think about, speaking of large language models and, other technologies, like the microphone, the iPhone, ChatGPT, and all of these things could be called the extended phenotype of our species. Maybe we transition from Homo sapiens to Homo techno. I'll leave that to other people to decide on the vocabulary. There's this idea, not idea, but there's this understanding that large language models are sequence predictors, stochastic parrots, as Emily Bender calls them, relying on statistics. Is the brain also a prediction machine in that way? Does it rely on statistics in that way? And if so, how?
Yes, I think the answer to that question will be yes, absolutely. I'm not saying that a large language model has the same competencies or architectures as a brain, but it certainly shares that fundamental capacity to predict. I'd also point out something else which is shared with the brain, which I think might become quite important, in our discussion. Um, Specifically the attention heads in transformers that are largely dominating in terms of large language models, that ability not just to predict but to attend to what is the most pertinent in terms of allowing you to predict. How far back in a sentence, for example, do I have to go to find the right content that predicts the next token or the next word? So that ability to attend selectively to various sources of evidence that might have some predictive validity or predictive power, I think is quite crucial. And that's certainly a feature of the brain. So I think prediction and the implicit attentional selection, or just more generally the ability to select, are two fundamental components which you'll find in your brain. Having said that, though, that is not sufficient to be a brain. To be a brain, you well, to be the brain of an agent, you have to have a generative model, a world model that predicts not just the next thing in some stream of text or some video. It has to predict the consequences of your actions. So that's quite crucial. So as soon as you say predicting the consequences of your actions, you've made two big moves. First of all, it's you, it's me. So there is a genuine, authentic agent in play, and they act. So we come back to the enactivist, the 4E, 5E, possibly 6E now, perspective. Then we're talking again about a situated engagement, a reciprocal engagement in the world that involves acting upon the world. That action, if you remember previously, I was careful not to say that the brain controls the muscles. I was saying that the brain can provide predictions that the reflexes can then fulfill in the periphery. So there are special kinds of predictions that pertain to the way that I act upon the world. But in order to predict how I'm going to act, I have to have a model of myself. I have to, more specifically, I have to have a model of the consequences of behaving like this or like that. And then I have to evaluate what is the most likely thing something like me would do. And then I select the most likely way forward, the most likely policy, or the most likely action. Now, notice I've used the word selection again. So selection here is like a mental or covert action, and only some agent or some self, whether it knows it's a self or not, is irrelevant. But only a self can select, choose. Um, and if I'm now choosing among different courses of action or paths of action into the future, on the basis of the consequences of those actions, then I am, I think you would be licensed to call me an agent. So that's, I think, that the the big thing about the brain is that it has our brain and your brain. It has the capacity to model counterfactual futures conditioned upon different ways of responding or acting. Um, and what I can do here is come back to your efficiency question. So if I am um, an agent and I have certain beliefs, subpersonal beliefs about the kind of agent I am, then I can always choose the paths of least action uh, in pertaining to not just the way that I act upon the world, but also the physics interpretation of an action, which is as time times energy. So if I'm selecting the path of least action into the future, what I'm doing is I'm choosing the course of action that is the most efficient in the sense that uses the least energy over the shortest amount of time. So the principle of least action is quite fundamental here, and it can be read in many different ways. If you can find the path of least action into the future, then you have found the most efficient path. It is also the path of least effort if I measure the effort as the amount of energy I have to use in order to pursue that path. So you can usually, either from the point of view of cognitive effort, from the point of view of thermodynamic efficiency, from the point of view of statistical efficiency, or from just the vernacular use of notions of efficiency and effort, you can always summarize this as things like you and me conforming to finding the paths of least action, selecting the right paths of least action into the future. And then if you allow me, um, the energy in question is the key thing, because in order to choose the path of least action, I have to be able to do an integration or a summation over time as I roll out into the future of this energy function, of this score of the likelihood or the probability that I will pursue this. And that's where we come back to the information seeking, the curious aspect that underwrites nearly all of our behavior, the uncertainty reduction. So I'm going to use a few words here just to sort of join a lot of dots together. So we've been talking about the fundamental imperative to deny or elude existential angst is to resolve uncertainty. Uncertainty mathematically is expected surprise. So if I'm in a situation where I have the greatest uncertainty, what that basically means, everywhere I turn, every game I play, everywhere I look, I'm going to be surprised. So before I actually make a move on the world, I know in advance, I expect that I'm going to be surprised whatever happens. So the average surprise or the expected surprise in this context is going to be very, very high if I'm uncertain, which means that the energy that determines this path of least action has to be a measure of surprise, and more specifically, an expected surprise. Um, that's nice because there are two ways of avoiding surprise or choosing the paths of least expected surprise. I can either choose the path that resolves uncertainty in the sense that it is providing information which reduces my uncertainty and my angst and makes that angst go away. So this would be those kinds of behaviors or that have an epistemic affordance, such as just seeing a Wikipedia page or just having access to your iPhone. These things have epistemic affordance because you know if you engage and pursue courses of action with your iPhone or with some sort of information that you want to secure via your iPhone, or you have access to a wiki page of this kind of that kind, or you use a large language model. All of these actions, all these policies, all have epistemic affordance because they resolve that existential angst simply by reducing uncertainty, which is as minimizing expected surprise. But there's another kind of expected surprise, which people in behavioral psychology and reinforcement learning will be more familiar with. There are certain things I would find very surprising, like being in pain, by being unloved, by being very, very cold, by being in water, by being upside down. There are lots of states of being that a priori are not characteristic of me or what I think I am. So, in order to minimize my expected surprise, it's not just sufficient to resolve uncertainty and to be a good scientist and to query the world in the right kind of way. I also have to do it under the constraint that I'm not going to act in a way that produces outcomes that have a high surprise conditioned on the kind of thing that I am. So what we have is really, if you put those two things together, technically putting them together, it gives you this expected surprise, which in my world is known as an expected free energy. What you actually have is um, a backdoor description of the two kinds of Bayes optimality that we talk about when we try to model people and decision making under uncertainty as Bayes optimal. We've got the Bayesian decision theoretic, the utilitarian expected utility theory, minimize expected loss part, which is avoiding surprising outcomes that are uncharacteristic of me. At the same time, you're also complying with the principles of optimal experimental design, and those were crafted in the 1950s and emerged subsequently in many guises, such as active learning by people like David McKay, acting in a way, designing the right experiments that maximize the information gain. So this problem, how do I behave in a way that resolves my uncertainty or maximizes the information gain? Well, if I'm a scientist, my behavior is the design of an experiment. And if I design an experiment, I'm going to design that experiment that provides the kind of data I anticipate or expect will resolve my uncertainty. As a scientist, it could be between an alternate hypothesis and a null hypothesis. So I don't know what the answer is, but I do know if I can get those data, that evidence, then I will be certain it's either this or this. And that's the essence of the epistemic affordance. That's the essence of the way that I resolve my existential angst. And I suspect that exactly the same for you, else you wouldn't be asking me these questions. So this is exactly what we're doing at the moment.
I know we're touching the free energy principle, and in some cases we've gone down certain tangents that have, you know, revolved around it. But I do want to ask, just for the high schooler, how do we explain the free energy principle? We already did in a way, but I just want to be incredibly direct with it and then use that as a launch pad to talk about how that relates to artificial intelligence.
Right. Um, So as you probably have seen, my response to that question is, do you want the sort of high road or low road? I think probably in this instance, if we're speaking to sort of high school um, students, um, I think the free energy principle can be accommodated just by noting that it is a the physics backstory to active inference and predictive processing. And certainly in the neurosciences, a particular instance of predictive processing that you were talking about before called predictive coding. Um, so I'm not going to talk about the free energy principle per se. To do that, I would talk about principles of least action. I would talk about pathological formulations. I would talk about the relationship to James's maximum entropy principle. And what I'll be talking about are the fundamental characteristics cast in terms of self-organization and dynamics that characterize self-sustaining systems. Any system, whether it's a small particle, a person or a population, a single cell, or an organ. Anything that can be described in terms of being a dynamical system embedded in a larger dynamical system, you can apply the free energy principle to. Um, and in so doing, you have a description of things that self-organize technically to their characteristic states or to a pullback attractor. And what basically that gives you is a way of writing down equations for the way that things behave if they exist, if they leave a legacy by just existing sufficiently long in certain characteristic states. And then you can apply that to reproduce and simulate and to understand self-organization of a mindful kind, of a possibly sentient kind, in terms of how information is abstracted from the world and assimilated in a way that provides the most likely behavior that underwrites this kind of self-organization. So the purpose of the free energy principle is beyond artificial intelligence. It's beyond it's even actually pre-physics in the sense you don't need to induce quantum mechanics or statistical mechanics. It's just the mechanics of self-organization of dynamical systems. However, one interesting teleological interpretation that falls out of this physics, the free energy principle in and of itself, which I should just bring to closure just by saying it is just a principle of least action, just like the kind of principles of least action you might have done, in the latter years of high school education that underwrites Newtonian mechanics, for example. It just describes the way things, like a ball, the trajectory of a ball that you throw. That's pursuing a path of least action. If you just generalize that concept to some abstract states of things, then things pursue states of least action. And from that, you can derive all that I was talking about before in terms of epistemic affordances and the way that we resolve our existential angst and avoiding being cold or unloved or upside down. Um, but one way of understanding it, which is, I think, much more intuitively, um, can be traced right back to the days of Plato. And it appeals to this notion of the brain as a fantastic organ that's generating fantasies and predictions of what's out there that's causing its sensory impressions. So the idea here is beautifully expressed by people like Andy Clark and Neil Seth, is that in general, in being a constructive organ, um, you're actively generating predictions, explanations, fantasies, hypotheses that provide the explanation, the best kind of explanation for what you're actually sensing. So, in a sense, the skull-bound brain is locked in, and can only guess what's going on by having these fantasies, having these hypotheses, having these um, um, notions of the causes of the sensory input from the world out there. And then it can use the mismatch between what it predicts it should be seeing, if it was right, and what it's actually sensing to update its beliefs. So basically, you're using sensory information not to extract the information from it in a sort of outside in kind of way, the kind of way that people thought about this, people like David Marr and colleagues in the 20th century. But now people think in the 21st century of the brain as a much more inside out process. I repeat, actively generating predictions that are used in order to test the veracity of the current fantasy, the current hypothesis, the current belief, subpersonal Bayesian belief about the world. So what the picture that ensues from that is that you generate these prediction errors at the, if you like, the boundary of the brain where it meets the sensations or meets the world. And then these prediction errors are then used to update and revise your representations, your hypotheses, your fantasies, until they better provide a better prediction. And that is often described in terms of minimizing prediction error. So the prediction error, again, is just this mismatch of what you predict and what you're actually sensing. Now, the interesting twist here, of course, is that the prediction error therefore just scores the surprise. The surprise that I would get with these sensations, given my predictions of what I thought I was going to sense. So the surprise is exactly the same surprise that we were talking about before when we talk about the expected surprise. And the free energy is a mathematical expression of this surprise. So under some simplifying assumptions, the free energy is just the amount of prediction error. So when I'm talking about coming back to your lovely notion of how do I cope with my ontological angst, I do it by trying to minimize my surprise about the world, actively trying to minimize my surprise, which simply means acting in a way, but also changing my mind in a way that reduces my prediction errors. It's the same thing. But note that there are two ways that you can minimize your prediction errors. You can either change your mind through neural activity and all the careful hierarchical processing, where you've got these prediction errors going into the brain, you've got these predictions coming out of the brain, so there's counter stream of predictions and prediction errors that are hierarchically organized so that we can have an abstract representation as we keep changing our mind or updating our explanation, our implicit explanation for the sensorium. But we can also change prediction errors by acting upon the world. So remember, the prediction error is the sensation minus the prediction. So I can make the prediction more like the sensation by changing my prediction, by changing my mind, by this recurrent reciprocal exchange, usually in a deep generative model or a deep hierarchical model or a world model with hierarchical depth, where you've got this recurrent message passing with predictions going towards the world and the prediction errors that ensue being propagated back deep into the brain, into the brain's generative model. Or I can make my sensations more like the predictions. So how do I do that? I simply move. So for example, I could just move my eyes and get a completely different pattern of sensory input. Furthermore, the signals I'm getting from my eye muscles that record the amount of stretch associated with a particular movement are being predicted. So instead of resolving what's called proprioceptive prediction errors by changing my mind about where my body is or where my eye is looking or what news channel I'm currently about to select, what I can do is actually act upon the world to make those predictions come true. Because there are certain kinds of prediction errors I can resolve reflexively by moving. So it is exactly why I was careful not to say the brain sends commands to the body. It sends predictions that the reflexes can then use to effectively resolve the prediction error by changing the sensations until the sensations I get from my muscles match exactly what I predicted. And this is how we actually move. So we sort of there are many ways of describing this. One I particularly like was from the 1980s and 90s, which was the equilibrium point hypothesis, which said that effectively all of our muscles, and you could also argue all of our autonomic physiological reflexes, work like a thermostat. So what you have to do as a brain is just set the control point or the preferred temperature you predict you will be sensing. And then you let the thermostat do all the heavy lifting to warm or cool the room until the temperature is exactly what you predicted. And that's exactly how our bodies work. And both our muscles and our secretory organs are our autonomic nervous systems. So it's all again about prediction, and those predictions are just in the game of resolving prediction error. And exactly the same sentiment that we were talking about resolving uncertainty. The uncertainty is the expected surprise or the expected prediction error, and that gets into the game when you decide what's the best action to take. But everything's basically about minimizing surprise or minimizing uncertainty through actively minimizing by acting upon the world. So that's active inference. So that's what that is saying is that the, the dual term active inference was actually a homage to active learning, which has the same, we mentioned before, which has the same notion that you can design experiments, so you can act upon the world, or you can gather the right kind of smart data that best informs your beliefs about the causes of your data. But you can do this in the moment, hence active inference, in terms of inferring now what's the cause of my sensations. I can move my eyes around every 250 milliseconds and palpate the world online in a way that is consistent with with my predictions, and that would be a description of active vision, for example. But I can also have active hearing or active listening. So the notion here is that we don't see, we look. We don't hear, we listen actively all the time, and that this action and perception hand in hand, this active inference, is just in the service of minimizing prediction error, which can be described mathematically as minimizing free energy in the spirit of finding the paths of least action, where the action is a free energy times the time taken to create to define the action.
Dr. Friston, I have no clue how to even try to begin to understand all of that on the first pass, so I'll try to go back on this podcast and make notes. I do want to dig in a little more, but I also want to be respectful of your time. I did want to talk about how you even came to this understanding. How did you find the free energy principle, or how the free energy principle found you? So if we could just explore that for a little bit, because I do think that this is such a deep and philosophical and technical thing to understand, but it's also just this like aha moment where it all makes sense. Like everything like your world model updates in a better way. So how did you even find out about this? How did you come to this understanding?
Well, as you say, it found me. So, there are many ways in which you could tell that story of how the free energy finds people. Um, Again, you could recourse back to philosophy via Kant and specifically Hermann von Helmholtz. So that's the story which most people tell, and certainly I would subscribe to that story. If you ask Geoffrey Hinton, who would he like to speak to if he could, it would be Helmholtz. So the Helmholtz encapsulated a lot of the ideas that we've just been talking about under the rubric of unconscious inference. Again, this notion that to perceive is to have on the inside an explanation for some sensations. And then all you do is, I repeat, use the prediction error to revise your inference. But it's not conscious. You have no volitional control of this. You just quickly and reflexively do this fast inference, say in the visual system, to recognize this as a face or an edge or some object in the visual world. But you can only recognize it if it's already in there. If you've learned to carve nature at its joints within this kind of generative model, within this functional brain anatomy, within this connectivity. Um, so that would be one story. And I think nicely unfolded by people like Richard Gregory, whose notion of perceptions hypothesis testing speaks exactly to that. That in itself, that perspective, was used by people like Geoffrey Hinton and Peter Diane to create a Helmholtz machine, which does this kind of inference. So that would be one story. By the time I got onto into the story, the key developments were first of all to look at inference under hierarchical models, and that was clearly inspired from a number of levels. The empirical neuroanatomy of visual hierarchies, which is a canonical feature of our brain, which we haven't had time to talk about. But the brain has not only this sort of simple cabbage-like structure, but it is also the areas are hierarchically organized such that you can think of it effectively as a sort of functional onion with layer upon layer upon layer upon layer. So when I talk about deep, I was thinking about passing through to deeper and deeper layers, and then the predictions ensuing from the deep, the center of the brain. It's not quite as simple as that, but there is a functional architecture that can be thought of along those lines. And then the next move was to make it inactive. Speaking to the pragmatic turn at the beginning of the century, it's not just about perception. It's not just about unconscious inference. Actually going back to the notions of Helmholtz, that the vision is inactive. That to understand is to palpate. It is to move in a way that solicits the right data in order to best test your hypotheses about what's going on at the moment. That perspective, you could also say, well, you could find that in things like perceptual control theory. So it has the same spirit in terms of emphasizing the importance of the intimate relationship between perception and action, in this instance, perception and control, and the emphasis on resolving prediction errors or surprise in the periphery. You could find this in the literature on heuristics, certainly the way that people like Gigerenzer sort of foreground the importance of resolving this kind of free energy or uncertainty would certainly emphasize that. You will find these ideas in cybernetics. So, for example, the laws of requisite variety and the good regulator theorem, both inheriting from the work of people like Ross Ashby and colleagues, again suggests that in order to actively control an environment in this inactive sense, any agent has to be a good model of its environment. That was provably so, certainly in the days when Ross Ashby was writing. So all of these different perspectives, right through to things like model predictive control, I think are all slightly different takes on what is an underlying principle, which is just a principle of least action. And that it is it's nice of you to associate that with me, but the free energy principle has been um, under the hood for, one could argue, millennia, but certainly a century or so. And just one aspect of that is that we've been talking about sort of a principle of least action and paths of least action and paths into the future. The way of scoring these paths in terms of so that you can find the path of least action, or the most likely thing I am likely to do, or the most likely explanation for this visual trajectory on this video input, or watching a bird flutter across my visual horizon. That free energy actually comes from the work of Richard Feynman. So if I went back in time, I'd like to speak to Richard Feynman, and probably more, I'd like to hear Richard Feynman talk to Hermann Helmholtz, or von Helmholtz. So in solving a particular problem or in the pathological formulation, Feynman actually invented the variation of free energy that is effectively the Lagrangian, or the energy that comprises the action, the time multiplied by energy in this path of least action perspective or pathological formulation. So that would be a more physicist's perspective. So I've given an appalling answer to your question, but it was really there are multiple roads to understanding and formulating and describing the free energy. I'll just mention one more just for completeness. The free energy principle is actually dual to a constrained maximum caliber principle due to James, who's famous for the max entry principle. So later in his life, in the 1980s, he applied the maximum entropy principle to paths in the same spirit as Feynman's path integral formulation. And that was when you put constraints on, and the constraints now are just what we're talking about in terms of satisficing or avoiding surprise, then that is very, very closely related to, if not dual to, the free energy principle, also known as a minimum entropy production or path entropy production principle, which is important because that speaks to the thermodynamics of the free energy principle in terms of the efficiency that you brought up earlier on.
Mm.
The 20-watt brain, this is why it's so efficient
Mm.
and why both informationally and statistically it is so efficient, because it is just pursuing the paths of least action. And this, I repeat, is exactly the same as James's formulation of measurement in physics or observation in physics, that you can describe measurement or observation simply as the minimum entropy production in relation to the paths you take during that method, or the trajectories, or the measurements you take over time.
Just to ask a fun question, it's probably going to be a very technical answer, but what would you ask Dr. Feynman if you could have dinner with him?
uh, if you well, to be honest, I asked you, can we go outside for a cigarette?
That's a good
That's the
question.
first thing I would say.
Absolutely. It's probably what wouldn't you ask him? Wouldn't you ask him? Because there's just so much to talk about. Um, I do want to still talk about the brain, but talk about something else, schizophrenia. I did watch a couple of videos of you talking about schizophrenia. What is schizophrenia precisely, and what are the mysteries behind the disease?
Right, that's a great question. And I've actually just read a book by my friend Ed Bullmore, who will be hopefully taking up the Regis Chair at the Institute of Psychiatry in London, now renamed. That is a must read, I think, if you really want to know the answer to that question. My life also has been deeply intertwined with thinking about dealing with schizophrenia. I spent the first part of my career as a clinical academic working in a um, a community of chronic people with chronic schizophrenia. So schizophrenia is a term for a broad set of psychotic conditions that can be probably best summarized in terms of the kinds of symptoms that, well, not symptoms in the sense that you don't always complain of them, but certainly the signs and of schizophrenia, which would include a various aspects of false inference, by which I mean false inference in exactly the same way that you would have done at school in terms of type 1 and type 2 errors in statistics. Inferring things are there when they're not, versus inferring things are not there when they are. So these are sort of type 1 and type 2 errors. When it comes to the brain as a statistical organ, as this constructive, fantastic organ that's trying to infer in virtue of trying to minimize the variation of free energy, which I should just join another dot, is exactly the same as something called an elbow in machine learning. So if you read about variational autoencoders in machine learning, they are optimized in a way that reduces what's called an evidence lower bound. That evidence lower bound is exactly mathematically the same as the negative variation of free energy due to Feynman and the free energy that underwrites the free energy principle. So I've lost my yes. You didn't want you thought it was going to be a technical answer. I'm giving you a technical answer. Can you remind me what the question was? Because
What are
I
the
got excited.
mysteries of schizophrenia?
Schizophrenia, yeah, false inference. I was just reminding myself that another way of describing minimizing free energy or path of least action is to infer. It's exactly what we do when we infer, make an inference about a group difference when we do a t-test, for example, or we infer something is like one of these or like one of those just by assessing the evidence. But if your inference mechanisms are compromised, in a way that leads you to these type 1 and type 2 errors, what would that look like in terms of the behavior of somebody, say, who had schizophrenia? Well, first of all, they would start to infer that certain things were present when they were not. So they might see things and perceive things that weren't actually there. They might start hearing voices, for example. Um, or they might have ideas that are just not um, evidenced by the sensory information at hand. So they may develop convictions that the newscaster is talking to them, for example. You may also have the kind of type 2 failure of inference where you're inferring something is not there when it is. So, for example, if you had a heavy neglect, not schizophrenia, but you had a particular condition due to a stroke, which meant that you just couldn't infer that there was anything on the right hand side of, sorry, the left hand side of your, yeah, uh, of your visual field. Um, and you might infer it wasn't there. At a slightly more abstract level, if you infer that you're not moving, then you won't move. And you will have a psychomotor poverty and and a whole set of interesting soft neurological signs that ensue from um, this kind of failure of inference, a very particular kind of failure of inference, which compromises your ability to bring explanations to the table from the sensory input. And sometimes that can actually make you more accurate in the way that you sense the world. So people with schizophrenia, in virtue of the fact that they may have difficulties um, um, in making sense of the world through this inference process, or through this free energy minimizing process or predictive coding mechanism. Um, because they're not confounded with prior beliefs and preconceptions that are basically scaffolding, carving nature at its joints in terms of providing explanation for the sensorium, they're actually much better at seeing what's actually there. So they're very resistant to illusions, for example. So paradoxically, there are some things that people with schizophrenia are much better at than people without schizophrenia. And you could even argue that the very fact that schizophrenia is still with us, that there must be some positive selective pressure for having this ability to relax one's prior assumptions in a particular way, in order to think laterally. And indeed, one of the characteristic disorders of thought in schizophrenia is a kind of lateral thinking, sometimes known as derailment or night's move thinking. So this disintegration of the explained world, and put it in Bloilerian terms, a disintegration of the inner life or the psyche as an explanation, a fantasy for what's going on out there, is sometimes well, it can be expressed at many, many different levels, either in in terms of perception, in terms of auditory hallucinations, right through to a derailment and a disorganization of thought processes that are expressed in sort of incoherent or odd language, or indeed odd behavior. Both in terms of the motor expression, but also the semantic or conceptual content. So that would be what schizophrenia, or how one way of describing schizophrenia. It's an impoverished sense making with false explanations being brought to the table, that can sometimes cause distress. They don't always, but sometimes they can cause distress, but they can certainly complicate an engagement of the person with schizophrenia with their world, and in particular the other people in that world. If you want, we can certainly, well, perhaps I'll just do it in one sentence and you pursue it if needs be. The particular failure in question is an interesting one. All the evidence that I know about at this sort of coarse-grained sort of functionalist or computational or inference account of schizophrenia points to a failure of the attentional mechanisms that we were talking about before. Do you remember we were mentioning large language models and transformer architectures, where there are attention heads that were able to select or to attend to particular prediction errors, for example? And it looks as though people with schizophrenia and possibly many other related, not related, but other psychiatric and possibly neurological conditions have a failure to deploy attention in the right kind of way. So if your readers and watchers want to pursue reading about, say, predictive processing and the cognitive neurosciences, they will come across predictive coding and prediction errors very, very quickly. As they get deeper into that literature, there will be a nuanced kind of account predicated on something called precision weighted prediction errors. And in fact, the free energy is not just the prediction error, it's the prediction error times how much confidence you place in that prediction error. And that's the precision. How trustworthy is this prediction error? If my sensory input is very, very noisy, or I am watching a news channel that has a reputation for fake news, there's lots of noise in play. So the information is going to be very imprecise. The prediction error cannot be trusted. It is fake news. And therefore, I'm going to downweight it and I'm going to effectively unselect it. I'm going to ignore it to a certain extent. And sometimes we have to do that. And one really interesting instance where we have to attenuate the precision of our sensory prediction errors is when we move. Because if we didn't ignore all the sensory evidence from our body and our eyes that we weren't moving, if we had the prior belief, the fantasy that I'm going to move, then all of the prediction errors would say, no, you're not moving. So immediately I would change my mind. I would revise my prior intention to move to, oh, I'm not moving. I would elicit or evince a kind of psychomotor poverty, such as with Parkinson's disease or people with certain forms of schizophrenia, either catatonic or showing a high degree of psychomotor poverty. So it becomes really important to be able to switch on and off various sources of prediction, and in particular the consequences of your own action. Remember, before we're talking about agents being defined as having generative models of the consequences of their own action. In order to actually act, you have to actually ignore the evidence you're not acting by attenuating the precision of the prediction errors that report the consequences of your action, so that they can then drive the reflexes in order to move. If you can't do that, imagine what it would be like. If you can't ignore everything selectively, given that we ignore 99.9% of all the sensory information currently bombarding our senses, imagine what it would be like. You'd be forced to supply explanations for all sorts of odd things. Let me give you, just a sort of simple example that might help make this a bit more tangible. Imagine for some reason I couldn't ignore the sensation of my heart racing or beating whilst I was watching the news. And because I can't ignore the bodily interoceptive sensations from my body, which would normally be only present when I was slightly anxious or emotionally aroused, for example. At the same time, I'm watching the news at 10, and the broadcaster is talking. And yet I have this sensation that I am emotionally aroused, or I have a sensation that I can't ignore that suggests that, well, the best explanation for these interoceptive sensations is that I am emotionally aroused, physiologically aroused. In conjunction with the fact I can't ignore that the newscaster is talking, well, therefore, the newscaster must have upset me. So the simplest explanation for this is the newscaster is now talking to me. So the best Bayes optimal plausible explanation that accounts for all this unattenuated evidence that I cannot ignore is that the newscaster is actually talking to me personally. And that's the simplest explanation that I can bring to the table in order to explain these unattenuated sources of sensory evidence, simply because I've lost the ability to deploy that attentional window, that attentional selection simply because I can't now attenuate the attention that I'm paying to this source of evidence or that source of evidence. So this is where the false inference mechanistically gets into play, because from the point of view of neurophysiology and um, the brain, the way that you attenuate is to change the gain or the excitability of various neuronal populations or neurons reporting the prediction error. It is precisely that excitability or gain control which is underwrites physiologically things like attentional selection, but also crucially, it's a site of action of all the drugs that work in psychiatry and largely in neurology as well. So you've now got you know a, an explanation based upon a fantastic organ that's doing inference, doing effectively statistics, but is slightly broken. Not because it can't detect differences, but it can't estimate the confidence on the standard error, on the precision of those prediction errors or those differences that go into, say, a T statistic. And because that delicate machinery has been lost and it can't be contextualized, attenuated, and then switched on again at the appropriate time, then you're going to succumb to these false inferences and then have these false beliefs. There's, to my mind, quite a beautiful link now between the physiology, the statistics, and the experience of the patient, the beliefs of the patient, that they all, if you like, make sense in relation to each other with a coherent story. So that would be an application of this kind of predictive processing that inherits from the free energy principle to schizophrenia, looking specifically at through the lens of inference and computation.
Beautiful. How are we doing on time, by the way? Do you have time for a handful of more questions?
Yes, that's of
Yeah,
course.
let's do it. These are just going to be easy layups for you, but I'm pretty sure all of these questions have been easy layups for you. What role do non-scientific sources of inspiration like art or sport play in your thinking?
In my thinking, well, I have to say, I think a lot of my thinking is a sport, and it is artistic. So, um, at a number of levels, you know, basically having a new raising a question by having by constructing a number of hypotheses that have not been had before is a creative act. And again, I said before that the mark of a good scientist is the quality of the questions that she asks. But of course, those questions only arise when you've got competing hypotheses. You have to construct and explore that hypothesis space where no one has been before. So that to me is quite a creative and exhausting uh, uh, act, which I'm sure artists and sports people also, in terms of finding new, was it the philosophy flop, or finding new ways of doing things or doing things better in a creative way, or finding, if you're a sort of a visual artist, finding the essence in a novel way, in a creative way, of conveying the sensory impressions that will induce the right kind of active inference and sense making in the viewer of that. Um,
Do you still find it fun?
oh yes,
Yes?
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, I
Even
mean,
after all
well,
this time?
yes, yes. Those aha moments are the only thing that keep us, well, I was going to say us all going, but certainly, yeah, that is what you strive for. And again, you just going back to your first question about, what underwrites that perseverance and that long horizon. It is, that you will have an aha moment. You even mentioned a little, having a little aha moment earlier on. This is why you do this. So you can have those, oh, I see. Oh, that's it. Resolve a bit more uncertainty. So if you just reassure yourself, there will be, if you work hard enough, if you climb this mountain, there will be an aha moment when you reach the top of this peak. But of course, that's just going to be the foothill of an enduring journey. And then you move on to the next aha moment. There's an interesting twist there because very often the aha moment is not creating a new explanation, it's actually finding a simpler explanation. Just realizing that this, and this were all just one of those. And it's that simplification, I think, which is usually um, underwrites the joy of an aha moment or insight. And I'm just wondering whether creativity is not so much about um, finding more and more complicated ways in which to communicate and to impress literally um, other people, um, but a simpler way of doing it, a more direct, a more powerful, a more efficient way of doing it. Um, and in many senses, um, that is, that kind of creativity, which would, I think, be sympathetically viewed by people who have, a predisposition towards minimalist art. I think would fit very, very comfortably with this notion of um, this notion of efficiency and simplicity and reducing the complexity of your argument, which is another way of thinking about the statistics of this these paths of least action.
What advice would you give to young scientists trying to navigate their academic career, but in an increasingly competitive environment?
Right. Um, I think the advice is just keep your options open, and don't worry about too much about finding the perfect job at the perfect time. Really, this is a journey. I was taken with the way that you were framing the different ways you could sort of deal with your life, your ambitions, and your endeavors. Um, and getting to the end point is not the way to look at this. It is the journey that is that keeps you on track, literally your path of least action. It's never ending. Well, it will end for me, but and you, but while we're on it, we might as well enjoy it. Um, that journey is going to be a much better journey if you keep your options open so you can literally explore the landscape and know what you don't know, and know where establish those epistemic affordances, establish the kinds of fields where an answer could be. So all sorts of different kinds of Googles, but in different fields and different domains. To do that, you've got to keep your foundational training broad. So just take any opportunity you can to have a broad foundational training. And then what will happen is there will be opportunities. Nothing in my career was planned. I've always been opportunistic, or opportunities have arisen um, that you just say yes or no to. And if you just keep making the right binary decisions, given the opportunities at hand, you will eventually find yourself pursuing the path of least action if you keep your options open. So my advice is not to worry too much about the prestige path. Do not sort of worry about going to the mecca of this or the mecca of that. Tomorrow's Mecca is never in the same place as today's Mecca. By through a certain kind of itinerancy as you pursue these paths of least action in this space of hypotheses or developments. So that would be my advice: is don't worry about it too much. Just choose those options that maximize the latitude of your foundational training, and as time goes on, you will find where your path is leading, and that's going to be enormously contextualized by the advances. So, for example, for me, it was brain imaging. I could not have planned that, but committing to doing brain imaging allowed me to learn about the statistics that allowed me then to return to my interest in the free energy principle, or sort of more generic physics of cognition and psychology.
If you had a magic wand and you could wave it and solve one problem in the world, what would it be and why?
um, I think it would be a slight reversal of current trends in terms of globalization and connectivity. Most of what I've been talking about, well, when you've been dealing with the physics and the psychology of self-organization of the kind that we've been talking about at many different levels, you realize the importance of um, sparsity in terms of maintaining the integrity of various things, whether it's my life or your life, or whether it's echo chambers or finance or wars or politics. All of the structure, the sustainable aspects, the things that you would want to leave a legacy for, and the legacies that ensue, all rest upon sparse connectivity, smart, if you like, sort of connectivity. I see that as that sparsity is very fragile and threatened at the moment by both, economically by globalization, but also by social media. That, to my mind, that poses the same dangers as cancer. So if you look at cancer as basically self-organization of cells that no longer sense their boundaries, then in exactly the same way, if you look at overconnectivity, say in social media or on the web, as basically destroying awareness of boundaries because the boundaries between things rest upon that sparse connectivity. Um, so if you destroy the structure that defines and individuates the members of an ensemble or a community, a population, a family, an institution, then you will, by definition, cease to exist as that cell population institution. So I see there are real dangers of connectivity. So I could wave a wand, it would be to reverse the trend in connectivity.
As a last question, what gives you hope in this world?
Um, well, the human condition, I think, is on which I participate, or of which I am an example, and together with everybody else, um, has, I think, this very wholesome aspect that has been refeatured throughout our conversation, that we're essentially curious, um, and in virtue of the fact that the world that I and you currently occupy is constituted by other things like me, then almost by definition, in order to enjoy that path of least action through that world, I have to be curious about other people. So there's something quite fundamental about self-organization in terms of the synchrony and the empathy and the sense making in relation to others that has to be part of an enduring society. So just knowing that it can't be any other way makes me quite hopeful that we're not going to that we can still enjoy those aha moments, we can enjoy those paths of least action that entail that resolution of uncertainty and eluding that existential angst, but also those paths of least action um, deny the opportunity for any catastrophic outcomes in principle.
Beautifully said. Dr. Friston, this was an amazing podcast episode. My first one of the year, so I'm very glad
Oh,
that I did it with you.
well, thank you very much. I very much enjoyed talking to you. Thank you.